the whisper that started everything. The night was calm, yet filled with something unexplainable. Flashes from cameras lit the soft rain outside the grand premiere hall. Sandra Bullock stepped out of her car, her smile calm but her eyes distant. Behind her, the crowd screamed her name, but she barely heard them. Her mind was somewhere else, in a quiet moment from the past that still whispered in her heart. Keanu Reeves arrived moments later, dressed simply as always. No heavy security, no loud energy, just quiet grace. When he stepped onto the red carpet, the noise around them changed. People didn't just cheer, they watched. They watched. Because when Keanu and Sandra finally stood next to each other, something felt different. The air seemed to hold its breath. It wasn't about fame or glamour anymore. It was about a connection that time had never been able to erase. Reporters shouted questions, flashes went off, but Sandra and Keanu barely spoke. They exchanged one silent look, long enough to say 1,000 words, but short enough to be missed by anyone not paying attention. Still, one photo captured it, her hand brushing his gaze softening in a way he rarely allowed. And that single photo became the spark that reignited years of speculation. Were they finally together? Or had they always been quietly, away from the noise? Inside the theater, as the lights dimmed, Sandra found herself seated beside Keanu. It wasn't planned, but destiny had its own strange ways. During the film, she caught him looking at her reflection on the big screen, not as a co-star, but as someone he had once trusted with his soul. She smiled faintly, pretending not to notice, yet every heartbeat reminded her of the truth she had buried deep, that Keanu was never just another friend. He was the one who had seen her when the world only wanted to see her image. After the premiere, the media followed every move they made. They walked together, spoke softly, laughed quietly. And for the first time in years, Sandra didn't stop him when he offered his arm. It felt natural, like breathing. The whispers grew louder, fans began to guess, and the internet exploded with theories. But what no one knew was that behind those smiles, there was a story. One that had begun long before the fame, and one that had never truly ended. Years ago, when they had first met on the set of Speed, something had shifted inside both of them. Sandra had felt his kindness immediately, the rare kind that doesn't need words or promises. Keanu had admired her strength, her laughter, her way of hiding pain behind humor. But back then, both of them were healing from their own battles. Sandra from heartbreak, Keanu from loss. So instead of falling in love, they built a silent bond, one that went deeper than romance, one that endured through years of distance. After the lake house, when the camera stopped rolling, they stayed in touch. Late-night calls, messages about life, sometimes months of silence followed by one message that said, "Are you okay?" And that was enough. They never forced anything, never defined what they were. But in every quiet message and every moment of shared silence, something grew, something pure, something unspoken. Now, as they sat together after the premiere, that silence returned, stronger than ever. Keanu looked at her with eyes that carried both peace and longing. Sandra took a deep breath, her voice trembling slightly as she said, "It's strange, isn't it? How after all these years, nothing feels different." Keanu smiled softly, his tone gentle. Maybe that's because it was never supposed to. Those words lingered between them. She wanted to ask what he meant, but before she could, a reporter interrupted, asking for photos. They stood side by side, his hand brushing the small of her back. Protective, not possessive. Cameras clicked again, but this time, even the photographers sensed something rare. This wasn't performance. This was truth. Later that night, as the crowd faded and silence returned, Sandra sat alone in her hotel room, staring at her phone. A message appeared. It was from Keanu. "You looked beautiful tonight, not because of the dress. Because you looked at peace." She stared at it for a long time, her heart pounding with emotions she thought she had long outgrown. She typed a reply, deleted it, then finally sent, "You always knew how to see me, didn't you?" The next morning, headlines were everywhere. Keanu and Sandra spotted together again. Fans were wild with excitement, media was full of speculation. But behind those headlines was a quiet truth both of them had accepted years ago. That love isn't about timing or labels or public declarations. It's about recognition, about two souls seeing each other clearly, even when the world looks away. Yet something unexpected was coming. A secret long kept between them was about to reach the surface. And when it did, everything the world believed about their story would change forever. Because the truth wasn't that they were becoming something. The truth was that they already were, and that truth, about what happened years ago, in a quiet ceremony far from Hollywood's noise, was about to be revealed to the world. The secret in the photograph, the morning after the premiere, was loud and chaotic. Articles filled the internet, clips flooded social media, and fans replayed every second of Keanu and Sandra's quiet moments together. Hashtags trended across platforms, and every talk show had one question: were they finally married? But while the world talked, Keanu sat silently by his window, a cup of cold coffee in his hand, staring at the faint light breaking through the clouds. He didn't check the news. He didn't scroll through his phone. He just sat, thinking about how peace always came to him right before everything changed. At the same time, in another part of the city, a young journalist named Claire Rosen scrolled through the new premiere photos. She wasn't looking for gossip. She was known for uncovering truths others ignored. While analyzing the images, her eyes caught something strange, a reflection in the background of one photo. It was small, barely visible, but clear enough to raise her curiosity. Behind Keanu and Sandra, reflected on a mirror stand, was a framed picture of the two of them. But this wasn't from Speed, nor from the lake house, nor any film they had done together. It looked like a personal moment, a memory the public had never seen. She zoomed in. The picture showed Keanu and Sandra standing close, her head resting on his shoulder, both dressed in plain clothes in what seemed like a garden. And there was something else, a ring. Not on her movie costume, not for a role, but a simple silver band on her left hand. Claire leaned back, her instincts whispering that this was not just a coincidence. If that image was real, then it meant something far bigger than anyone knew. While the internet buzzed, Sandra was trying to stay calm. She sat in her kitchen, her hair tied back, wearing an old sweatshirt that Keanu had once given her during a rainy shoot day. Her phone kept vibrating with calls and texts from friends, agents, and studios. Everyone wanted answers. She ignored most of them except one, a message from Keanu. "They're saying a lot of things. Maybe it's time we stop hiding." Her hands trembled. She had always feared this day, the day the truth would come out. Not because she was ashamed, but because she valued their peace more than the world's approval. She typed back, "Are you sure you're ready for that?" "Once it's out, we can't take it back," he replied. "I've been ready for years. Maybe it's time they see what love looks like when it survives silence." That evening, Claire visited the photo agency that captured the images. She requested the original files, claiming she was verifying details for a piece on the premiere lighting. When she saw the untouched file, the reflection was even clearer. And it wasn't just any garden. It was a private property in Hawaii, one known to belong to Keanu's late friend, a place he often visited to escape Hollywood's noise. Claire knew she had something that could change the narrative forever. The next day, Sandra visited Keanu's home. As she entered, she saw him sitting quietly by the piano. He looked up and smiled, that same calm smile that had always disarmed her. "You saw the picture, didn't you?" she asked softly. He nodded. "Yeah, it was bound to surface someday." She walked closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are we really doing this, Keanu?" He turned to her, eyes steady. "We're not doing anything wrong. We just stopped pretending." They sat together for a long time, saying nothing. Outside, rain began to fall again, the kind that always seemed to follow them. Gentle, cleansing, endless. Finally, Sandra spoke. "Remember that day? The one in the picture?" Keanu's lips curved slightly. "How could I forget? You were so nervous you dropped the ring twice." She laughed quietly, her eyes glistening. "And you said it was good luck. That mistakes make love stronger." He looked down at his hands. "It did, didn't it?" She nodded, tears welling. It did. In that moment, both of them felt the weight of their secret again, the secret that they had carried for nearly a decade. A quiet wedding, attended only by a few close friends, far from fame, far from cameras, no press, no announcement, just two people choosing peace over spectacle. For years, they had promised to protect it, not because they didn't want the world to know, but because they wanted to keep something sacred, untouched by noise. As they sat in silence, Keanu's phone rang. It was Claire Rosen. Her voice was respectful, careful. "Mr. Reeves, Mrs. Bullock, I think you deserve to know before anyone else. I found a photo. I don't want to publish it without your words. But if I don't, someone else will." Keanu glanced at Sandra. She gave a small nod. "Thank you for calling, Claire," he said. "Maybe it's time we tell the truth." After the call, Sandra stood up and walked to the window. The city lights shimmered below, and she whispered, "I never wanted our love to become a headline." Keanu joined her, placing his hand gently over hers. "It won't be. It'll be a story. One that reminds people what patience and honesty look like." A week later, Claire's article went live. The headline was simple, not sensational. "A love kept quiet. The truth behind Keanu Reeves and Sandra Bullock's connection." It wasn't gossip, it was grace. She wrote about their bond, their humility, and how two of Hollywood's most private souls had chosen to keep something real, away from the noise. The world didn't mock them, it admired them. People called it the most beautiful love story Hollywood had forgotten, but the story didn't end there. Because as the world embraced their truth, a storm was quietly building. An old friend from their past, someone who had once known their secret, was about to come forward, not with kindness, but with something else. Something that would test the very love they had spent years protecting. And for the first time, Keanu and Sandra would have to face not just the world's eyes, but the ghosts of their own past. The voice from the shadows, the days after Claire's article, felt strangely calm on the surface. Yet beneath that calm, a quiet unease grew. Keanu and Sandra had faced interviews, carefully choosing their words, never confirming or denying, only smiling when asked about the photo. Their silence carried more truth than any statement could. Fans felt peace seeing them together, believing that love, real love, still existed in a world built on appearances. But peace never lasts long when the world starts remembering. One evening, while Keanu was rehearsing lines for a new independent film, his assistant walked into the studio holding an envelope. "This came for you," she said quietly. No return address, no sender. Just his name written in delicate, almost trembling handwriting. Keanu opened it slowly, his instincts tightening like they always did before something life-changing. Inside was a single photograph, one he hadn't seen in years. It was from the same day as the hidden wedding in Hawaii. He was standing beside Sandra, both smiling, the ocean wind brushing their hair. But behind them, blurred in the background, stood someone else, a familiar silhouette. The letter inside was short. "You thought you could hide forever. I think it's time the world knows the whole story." Keanu stared at it for a long time, the paper crumpling slightly in his hand. The handwriting stirred a memory. He remembered a friend from the old days, someone who had once been close to both of them during the Lake House shoot, a producer's assistant named Elena. She had been kind, gentle, and deeply loyal to Sandra, or so they had believed. But after the private ceremony, something had changed. She had disappeared, quitting suddenly, leaving only a short message saying she needed to get away from all the lies. Keanu had always wondered what she meant. Now he knew. That night he called Sandra. She answered on the second ring, her voice soft. "I knew something was wrong the moment I felt you thinking." Keanu took a slow breath. "She's back." There was silence on the line, followed by a whisper. "Elena?" He said nothing, but the quiet was enough. 2 days later, a news outlet released an anonymous tip, claims that the marriage story was staged, that the Hawaii photo was part of a publicity plan to revive an old project. It was a lie, but it spread fast. Within hours, every corner of the internet filled with opinions. Half believed it, half defended them. Keanu stayed quiet, but Sandra felt her heart ache in ways words couldn't explain. She had lived her life carefully, never chasing drama, never inviting noise. Now, her piece was being rewritten by someone else's bitterness. Meanwhile, Elena was sitting in a small apartment far from Los Angeles, staring at her computer screen. Her eyes were red, her face tired. She wasn't evil, just broken. Years ago, she had loved someone quietly, secretly, and that someone had been Keanu. She had never told him, never told Sandra. She had only watched them grow close, feeling both joy and pain, until the day she saw them exchange vows under that golden Hawaiian sun. That day, something in her heart cracked, and she ran. Now, years later, loneliness had turned that crack into a wound that refused to heal. When she saw the photo resurface online, old jealousy whispered again. She convinced herself the truth deserved to come out even if her version of truth was shaped by pain, not facts. But fate has a strange way of revealing the difference between revenge and regret. A week after the false rumor broke, Claire Rosen visited Keanu again for a follow-up interview. She noticed his quiet tension, the tired calm in his eyes. Halfway through their talk, she placed a recorder on the table and said, "Someone's trying to twist your story. I think I know who." Keanu looked up sharply. "You've heard from her?" Claire nodded. "She reached out. She wanted me to publish her version. I didn't. I think she's hurting, not scheming." Sandra joined them later, wearing a soft beige sweater, her expression thoughtful. "Then maybe she needs to see the truth again. Not through headlines, but through us." Keanu turned to her, confused. "What do you mean?" Sandra smiled faintly, that calm confidence she always carried returning to her face. "I mean, we stop running from the past. We show it." A week later, they invited Claire to a quiet studio. No press, no lights, just one camera and 2 chairs. Keanu and Sandra sat side by side and spoke, not about gossip, not about their marriage, but about love, loss, and the courage to protect what's real. They never said, "We are married." They didn't need to. They talked about respect, about choosing silence over spectacle, about how love sometimes lives best when it's not constantly explained. When the video went live, something beautiful happened. People didn't argue. They listened. The tone of the internet softened. Comments filled with gratitude, not noise. Fans wrote that their calmness felt healing, like a reminder that not everything needed to be exposed to be true. But as peace began to return, Elena watched the video from her small apartment. Tears rolled down her face as she heard Sandra say, "Sometimes those who hurt us aren't villains. They're just people who never learned how to heal." She closed her laptop, her guilt finally heavier than her anger. For the first time in years, she wrote a message, short, sincere, trembling. "I'm sorry." I didn't know how to handle the silence. She didn't send it yet, but she would. That night, Sandra and Keanu sat together on his balcony, the city quiet below. She leaned her head on his shoulder, whispering, "Do you think the world will ever stop needing to know everything?" He smiled softly. "Maybe not. But as long as we know, that's enough." They sat there for hours, watching the city lights flicker like memories, each one representing a choice, a pain, a miracle. And somewhere out there, a woman they once called a friend was preparing to make one more choice, one that could either heal the story completely or break it forever. When the past knocked at their door, the day began like any other. A quiet sunrise over Los Angeles, the city yawning awake beneath soft clouds. Keanu brewed coffee in his kitchen, the kind of morning peace he cherished. Sandra was in the garden, watering the small white lilies she had planted weeks ago. She often said flowers were her way of talking to time, growing something gentle in a world that kept rushing forward. But today, time was about to bring something back. Something they thought was gone forever. As the doorbell rang, Keanu wiped his hands on a towel and walked to answer it. The moment he opened the door, the air shifted. Standing there was Elena. Her eyes were tired, framed by years of regret. She wasn't dressed for confrontation. No makeup, no posture of pride, just quiet exhaustion. In her hands, she held a single envelope. Keanu froze for a second, surprise flickering in his usually calm eyes. "Elena," he said softly. "You look the same," she replied with a faint, sad smile. "And you still make coffee the same way. Black, no sugar." Before he could respond, Sandra appeared behind him. She stopped mid-step, her face turning pale for a moment, then softening. "You came," Sandra whispered. Elena nodded. "I had to." Keanu stepped aside, motioning for her to come in. They sat in the living room, the silence between them thick but not angry, just full of years that had never been spoken about. Finally, Sandra broke the stillness. "You hurt us," she said quietly. "But I think you hurt yourself even more." Elena lowered her gaze. "I know. I was jealous, not of what you had, but of the peace you both carried. I mistook your silence for secrecy, your love for betrayal. I told myself I was exposing a lie, but I was only exposing my own bitterness." Keanu leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "You didn't destroy us, Elena. You just reminded us what we were fighting for." She looked up, tears gathering in her eyes. "I saw your interview. When Sandra said that people who hurt others are just those who never learned how to heal, I knew she meant me." Sandra smiled faintly, her voice gentle. "I did, because I was one of those people too once. We all break in different ways, Elena. Some of us just take longer to find the light again." For a while, no one spoke. The sound of rain began to tap softly against the windows. Elena finally placed the envelope on the table. "This is everything I still had. Photos, letters, and one video from that day. I wanted to burn them, but I think they belong to you now." Keanu opened the envelope carefully. Inside were old photographs from the day of their quiet wedding. Some were blurred, others perfectly framed. One photo showed them standing beneath a tree filled with white blossoms, holding hands, smiling like two souls who had found peace after years of storms. He stared at it for a long time, then looked up. "You kept these?" "I couldn't throw them away," she whispered. They were the only proof that something pure still existed in a world that often feels fake. Sandra reached across the table and took Elena's hand. "Then maybe it's time we stop letting the past be something that haunts us. Maybe it can finally become something that heals." For the first time, Elena smiled. A real one. Fragile, but real. "You both still believe in forgiveness, don't you?" Keanu looked at her, his voice soft. "We have to. Otherwise, we lose the very thing that kept us human." That evening, as Elena left, the sky began to clear. Sandra watched her car disappear into the soft orange glow of sunset. "Do you think she'll be okay?" she asked quietly. Keanu nodded. "She's starting her healing. Sometimes all it takes is someone not turning their back." Later that night, Keanu sat alone on the balcony, the same envelope resting beside him. Sandra joined him, wrapping a light shawl around her shoulders. "You know," she said softly, "I think this story has been bigger than us all along." He looked at her, curious. "How do you mean?" "We started hiding because we wanted to protect what was real," she said. "But maybe the reason it survived was because we never tried to make it perfect. We just let it be human." He smiled at her words, and for a moment, everything felt simple again. The stars above, the quiet night, the warmth of her hand in his. But far away, as peace settled back into their lives, something else began to stir. Claire Rosen, the journalist who had helped them share their story, received a call from an international network offering to make a documentary about Keanu and Sandra's love, the real hidden story behind it all. The project promised to be honest, respectful, and deeply human. Yet when she reached out to them about it, she could hear the hesitation in Keanu's voice. "I don't know if we're ready to live it all over again," he said quietly. Sandra looked torn, too. "If we open that door," she whispered, "we can't close it again." Claire paused for a long time, then said, "Maybe the world doesn't need another story about you. Maybe it needs a story about what love becomes when it chooses silence." That sentence lingered long after the call ended. Keanu and Sandra sat together again, watching the moonlight ripple across the pool. Sandra leaned closer, her voice barely audible. "Maybe it's time the world hears it. But this time, in our way." And just like that, a new decision began to form. One that would reveal the truth not as gossip, but as a lesson, as a memory, as something that could remind millions of people that love, when it's real, doesn't need noise to be eternal. They didn't know it yet, but the story they were about to share would touch lives far beyond Hollywood and uncover one final truth neither of them had spoken out loud, because sometimes the last secret between two people is not about what they hide, but about what they finally choose to show. The story they chose to tell a soft wind moved through the curtains as the morning sun poured into the quiet room. Keanu sat at the kitchen table flipping through the photos Elena had returned. Each one carried a piece of their past: laughter, peace, mistakes, forgiveness. He wasn't sure what hurt more, the years they had hidden or the beauty of realizing how much they had silently protected each other. Sandra walked in, holding 2 cups of tea. "Still thinking about it?" she asked gently. He nodded. "Yeah, it's strange. All these years we tried to stay invisible, and now the world finally wants to see the truth." She smiled faintly, setting 1 cup beside him. "Maybe they don't just want to see it. Maybe they need to." That afternoon, Claire arrived with her small film crew. No fancy lighting, no stage makeup. She promised it would be simple, just their voices, their story, told in their own rhythm. The camera would roll quietly, almost invisible, as if the audience were simply listening to a private conversation between 2 old souls. The first question Claire asked was gentle. "When did you know it was love, not just friendship?" Sandra looked at Keanu. He gave her a soft nod, letting her speak first. She took a deep breath. It wasn't one moment. It was a collection of small ones. Like when he remembered how I took my coffee, or when he'd call me on the days I didn't say I was sad, but he somehow knew. Love didn't rush in like thunder. It grew slowly, quietly, until one day I realized I couldn't imagine peace without him. Keanu smiled quietly, his voice steady. For me, it was the way she understood silence. She never filled it with words. She just stayed, and sometimes that's what love really is. Staying, when it would be easier to leave. The room fell silent for a moment. The crew, though professionals, felt something deep in that stillness. There was no performance, no act. Just 2 people speaking from a place most of the world rarely sees, raw honesty. As the hours passed, they spoke about the years after their secret ceremony, how they chose to live separately, each with their own careers, each giving the other space to grow. They spoke of loss, the people they had loved and lost along the way, the grief that shaped them, the hope that rebuilt them. Sandra's voice trembled slightly when she spoke about her late partner years ago, and how Keanu had stood by her quietly during those painful months. He never said much, she recalled. He'd just show up with groceries, cook in silence, and leave notes like "breathe today." I think that's when I learned that love isn't about fixing someone. It's about walking beside them until they can stand again. Keanu looked at her with that same quiet tenderness that had always defined him. "I wasn't saving her," he said softly. "She was teaching me how to live again, too, after all the losses I had." I think we both became each other's reminder that life can still be gentle. The footage captured something pure, not a Hollywood romance. Not a story built on glamour, but 2 human beings who had found peace in understanding each other's broken pieces. When the filming ended, Claire packed her equipment carefully. "You know," she said quietly, "this isn't a love story. It's a mirror. People will see themselves in it." Sandra nodded, her voice filled with calm strength. "That's what we wanted. Not perfection, just truth. A few weeks later, the short documentary titled Silence Between Hearts premiered online. It wasn't released through a big studio, just a quiet upload through Claire's independent channel. Within hours, millions had watched it. Comments flooded in. Stories of people forgiving old lovers, reconnecting with lost friends, remembering the gentle moments that had once made them feel alive. People didn't ask for proof of marriage anymore. They didn't need to. The way Keanu looked at Sandra when she spoke, the way she smiled whenever he turned his head. That was enough. But among all the praise, one message stood out. It was from Elena. She had written publicly under her own name. "Thank you for forgiving me. Your story reminded me that love is not about being chosen. It's about learning to choose peace even when it hurts. You taught me that." The message went viral. Not for drama, but for its raw humanity. It showed that even the person who once broke their peace had now found her own healing through their story. Days later, Keanu and Sandra sat by the ocean, the same beach where they had once said their vows. The world now knew, but in a way they could accept. No noise, no tabloids, just quiet acknowledgement. Sandra looked out at the waves, her voice almost carried away by the wind. "You know, it feels strange. We kept our love a secret for so long, and now that everyone knows, it somehow feels even more private." Keanu smiled. "Maybe because real love isn't made smaller by being seen. It's made stronger." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "Do you think people will move on from this now?" He chuckled softly. "Maybe. Or maybe they'll just remember that somewhere in all this noise. Two people chose kindness over chaos." As the sun sank below the horizon, they held hands quietly, the waves brushing the shore like whispers of time. They had been through storms, lies, and forgiveness, and somehow the calm had found them again. Yet as the light faded, a faint sense of mystery still lingered. In Claire's final cut of the documentary, she had included a single unseen clip, one she hadn't told them about. It was footage from Elena's old camera, showing Keanu and Sandra exchanging vows in the Hawaiian garden. But right at the end, before the video faded to black, Sandra whispered something softly to Keanu that the world hadn't yet heard. And soon, everyone would find out what those words meant. Because that whisper held one last truth about their love. The whisper that completed everything. The air was soft that evening. The kind that makes the world feel slower. Keanu and Sandra were at home, surrounded by the peace they had fought years to earn. The documentary Silence Between Hearts had already changed lives across the world. Millions had written letters, emails, and comments about how their story helped them believe in love again. But for the two people who had lived that story, it wasn't fame or validation that mattered. It was the silence that had finally found its rest. Then one morning, Claire called. Her voice carried both excitement and hesitation. "There's something I need to tell you," she said softly. "I included a clip at the end of the film. I didn't mean to surprise you, but I thought people deserved to feel what I felt when I found it." Keanu listened quietly. "What clip?" Claire exhaled. "It's from Elena's footage. It's the whisper Sandra said to you right after you exchanged rings." There was a long silence. Keanu turned to look at Sandra, who was sitting across the room, watching him with gentle curiosity. "What did I say?" she asked. Claire replied softly, "You'll see. It's already spreading everywhere." That evening, they sat together, playing the video on their living room screen. The old footage appeared, their private ceremony in the Hawaiian garden. The camera was a little shaky, the colors faded, but the moment was real. Sandra in a simple white dress, barefoot on the soft grass. Keanu in a linen shirt, smiling with a peace he hadn't known before. The wind moved through the trees, carrying the sound of the ocean. Then came the whisper. Sandra leaned in close to him, resting her forehead against his, and said softly, "If the world ever finds out, promise me we'll stay kind." Keanu froze watching it, his eyes filled with quiet emotion. Sandra placed a hand over her heart, whispering almost to herself, "I had forgotten I said that." The video faded to black, but those words lingered. "If the world ever finds out, promise me we'll stay kind." The internet erupted again, but this time not with noise, but with warmth. People shared the line everywhere, writing it on images, art, and letters. Couples renewed their vows, quoting it. Strangers told each other that kindness was the last form of love that never fades. The whisper became a symbol of something deeper, a reminder that love isn't about possession or perfection, but about gentleness even when the world demands spectacle. In interviews that followed, both Keanu and Sandra stayed humble. They never used the attention for promotion or gain. Instead, they used their platform to speak about compassion, mental health, grief, and healing. They started a small foundation quietly, funding programs for orphaned children and struggling artists, those who carried stories that the world didn't listen to. They called it the Silent Promise, inspired by the whisper that had reached millions of hearts. Months passed. Awards came, not for acting, but for humanity. Every time they stood on stage, they spoke with the same stillness that had defined them from the beginning. "Our story isn't about fame," Sandra said once. "It's about peace, the kind that comes when you love without needing to prove it." But away from the cameras, their lives were simple. Mornings filled with coffee and quiet walks. Evenings filled with music, sometimes silence, sometimes laughter. They had built a home that didn't need walls of luxury, only presence. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Sandra stood on their balcony, watching the city lights shimmer like scattered stars. Keanu joined her, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "You remember that day?" he asked softly. "Our wedding?" She smiled. "Every second of it. Especially that whisper." He looked at her, eyes warm. "You were right. The world did find out, and we stayed kind." She leaned her head against his chest, and that's what made it real. For a long time, they stood in silence. Birds flew across the fading sky, and the scent of jasmine filled the air. It was one of those moments that didn't need words, because everything had already been said, years ago, through love that refused to die quietly. A few years later, Claire released a follow-up documentary, not about their love this time, but about what that whisper had inspired. She interviewed couples, families, and strangers who had been touched by the story. A woman in Brazil said she forgave her husband after watching the film. A man in Japan wrote that he reconnected with his estranged mother after 10 years. A child in India painted the quote on her school wall. The whisper had become more than words. It had become movement, proof that even quiet love can echo louder than fame. In the final scene of Claire's follow-up, she visited Keanu and Sandra at their home. They were older now, calmer, wiser. They sat on the porch holding hands, their eyes filled with years of peace. "Do you ever wish you had done things differently?" Claire asked softly. Keanu smiled. "No. I think if we hadn't hidden it, it wouldn't have survived. Love needs shelter before it can be shared," Sandra nodded. "And when we finally shared it, it wasn't about us anymore. It was about everyone who needed to remember that gentle love still exists." The camera lingered as they looked out at the horizon. The wind brushed against their faces, the same kind that once carried her whisper years ago. Sandra turned to Keanu, her voice tender. "You know, if I could go back, I'd whisper the same thing again." Keanu smiled, his tone soft, filled with affection that had lasted lifetimes. "And I'd make the same promise." The scene faded to the sound of the ocean, steady, endless, eternal. And just like that, their story ended the way it had begun, not with noise or headlines, but with silence that spoke louder than anything else.